We're living through a boredom epidemic. Boredom of sex, that is. More women are reporting low sexual desire than ever before. And some of the numbers behind this honestly shocked me. A lot of Gen Z women are stopping having sex altogether. And in long-term relationships, the number of women who want frequent sex tends to go down with each passing year. Now, if you're in this dynamic, it can be incredibly frustrating. If you're the woman, you might be thinking, why don't I want this anymore? Is there something wrong with me? And if you're the man, honestly, it just feels like rejection. Like the person you want doesn't want you anymore. No one is closer to this tension than Dr. Lori Brotto. A lot of people claim to be experts in sex, but Dr. Brotto is one in the truest sense. She spent decades studying women's desire, hundreds of papers, thousands of patients. So why is this happening? We're about to find out. But real quick, there are a lot of new people here. We're about to cross a major milestone with this channel, and honestly, it's been really beautiful to see. But one of the things our team has been noticing is that a lot of you watch these episodes, come back to them, even send them to people you love, and still haven't subscribed. So I'm just asking you plainly, if this show has helped you or you want more conversations like this, hit the subscribe button. And if you already have, hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's next. A lot goes into the show behind the scenes, the research, the guests, the questions, the care. And we do that because we really want to help you. So please help us keep doing that. Subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely makes a difference. So Dr. Brotto, there's a story about one of your clients that really struck me in your book. Sarah, she's in her 30s. So tell me about the grocery list story and what sex started to feel like for her.
Yeah. Sarah is not an atypical case in the sex therapist's office, and she was quite a successful young woman in her early 30s in a fairly new relationship. It was about 3 years old. The first 6 months of her relationship, I remember her characterizing the sex as fiery and on edge and adventurous, always exciting, always in the context of doing really exciting things with her then boyfriend at the time. And at about the 6-month point of their relationship, she recalled to me one day noticing in the middle of sex, in the middle of intercourse, which felt quite good, as she recalled it, she remembers starting to make a grocery list in her mind. And some moments passed, and then she caught herself and didn't think too much of it at the time and kind of redirected the focus back to the sexual interaction. But as the days and weeks continued on, this incident, this kind of lapse of attention of moving from, this fiery, pleasure-filled sexual encounter to making a grocery list of all things really upset her. She was also someone who experienced a lot of anxiety in her life. She was very preoccupied with what other people thought of her, concerned about making a good impression, a good image. And along with that, she tended to be quite hypervigilant to cues. So she would notice if, someone kind of looked at her in a way that expressed disapproval. And so I remember her recounting this story to me, thinking back, of course, at this incident. And, when she noticed that her mind started making the grocery list, her first thought was, oh gosh, the fire is gone, right? And then, of course, as the weeks went on, she started to really kind of perseverate on this fact that the fire was gone. It wasn't as passionate anymore. What did this mean about the relationship? This was the first partner she really loved. Although interestingly, there was a long line of repeated patterns, always at about the 6-month point when she noticed that passion started to fade with her. And with time, she seriously questioned the relationship. And so the focus of our work together was really trying to understand what this meant for her, that grocery list. Why was it so symbolic for her to the point where she postponed the wedding with her partner?
She postponed the wedding?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite the action to take.
It's quite the action.
Yeah.
Although, again, not uncommon.
Yeah, I think what's striking about that story for me is I mean, I read it and I'm like, this is almost funny on the surface, like comical, like you're thinking about a grocery list while you're having sex. But I imagine a lot of people hear that and then they laugh and they're like, oh, that's really sad. I never want that to be me,
Right.
ever. And so why do you feel like, she postponed the wedding, but why do you feel like that feels like such a devastating outcome for people?
Yeah. I think, first of all, those kinds of lapses in attention where your attention moves from something which is as exciting as sexual activity, even when it feels really good, and it moves to these, benign, distracting places is really, really common. We actually know there's been a lot of research that's looked at how common that is. But for her in particular, because she was someone who was anxious and prone to being very concerned about what others think of her. And she also tended to catastrophize, which is kind of, make a mountain out of a molehill, so to speak. She was convinced that this movement away from focusing on sex to writing the grocery list was almost, a canary in the coal mine. It meant that passion was gone and the relationship was over. So certainly an extreme example of what happens when we have a lapse in attention. But I would say it's certainly not uncommon among the people that I see in my clinical practice. And what it means for, the fate of the relationship when the mind drifts, which it often does.
In our minds, what do you think desire is like proof of? Like, why does it carry so much significance in a relationship?
Yeah, I mean, there's at a very surface level, it's desire for sex, which is, an in-the-moment feeling. But I think for a lot of people, and certainly the people that I see in my clinical practice, desire is indeed symbolic. It is, am I capable of having a response that is fulfilling in the way that people, quote, should be having a sexual response? Also, for a lot of people, desire is symbolic of attraction in a relationship.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why declines in desire, which again are almost universal and inevitable that they decline as a relationship continues on. And that a lot of people really question, am I still attracted to my partner? And then the receiving partner also feels the same way. Is my partner attracted to me if their desire has gone down? And that's, I think, one of the real challenges and also one of the sort of really fun parts, if you will, of being a sex therapist is trying to understand what does a decline in a desire mean for you? And it's usually not about the sex itself.
While all this is going on, there's the other person
right.
in this dynamic. Like they might be having sex and they're not thinking about a grocery list or
right.
something else. Is low desire like something that's usually communicated to that person, or is it something that goes unspoken and it's like, I had no idea that you felt this, and kind of the woman in the scenario will be carrying it like silently?
So I think in general, we continue to have real discomfort around communication around sex. And a very common phrase that I'm told, again, in my clinical setting is, we communicate so well in every other domain about finances and our future and the children, and we even fight really well. But when it comes to sex, we simply don't know where to start. And, we can sort of trace that back historically to we're actually not taught about how to communicate about sex, even if you're lucky enough to have sex education. And yet communication about sex is found to be one of the strongest predictors of sexual satisfaction in couples in the long term.
Really?
So it's not frequency of sex. It's not the strength of orgasms. It is, do they communicate about sex? And so it really can be at the heart of, that kind of finding oneself or in a couple to be absolutely stuck. And really difficult to talk about. And yet when people walk into the sex therapist's office, that's the first thing that we do. And so in a way, it's sort of like exposure therapy, right? So we're going to, talk about all the difficult scenarios. We're going to use the words that you are so embarrassed to use. And we're going to immerse you in a way because that will then open up the pathway to really get into what's at the root of this difficulty. So I would say, certainly of the folks that I see in my clinical practice, the vast majority have difficulties talking about sex with their partners.
To the person that might not have low desire, or the other side of the partner in the relationship, like what does low desire tend to communicate to the partner who still wants sex?
Oh, you're not attracted to me. That's usually the first interpretation. It's not sex you're not desiring, it's me you're not desiring. And so it becomes a very, very personal statement about you're not desiring me in a sexual way, and therefore, are you even desiring me as a human being, as a partner? And again, paired with lack of communication, you can see how a partner is walking around with all of these myths and beliefs that can continue on for months, if not years. And even, I'm always struck by how often couples in long-term relationships will say, well, they should know that I don't mean that. There's this sense of, if you've been in a long-term relationship.
It's like telepathy or something. Mind
reading. Yeah. It's a famous cognitive error called mind reading that we do. And once we name it in the session and we say it's a fallacy, and it's always safer to assume that a partner, no matter how long you've been together, can't read your mind, than can read your mind. And so that's usually where a partner goes, is it's not sex that she doesn't desire, it's me.
It's interesting because all of this stuff is it's not just happening in a vacuum or in a box. It's like all the things that we tend to think about sex and what low desire means is in the context of a culture that gives off certain narratives about what sex should be or what it should be like or how passionate or fiery it should be. And so, yeah, if there's just complete silence, what ends up happening when over the long term of relationship, when one person feels like something's wrong with them and the other feels unwanted.
Yeah. And so this this is always best conceptualized as from a couple perspective. So often when, typically a woman will seek out my assistance for sex therapy for her low desire, but it's her low desire relative to her partner's higher desire. So we talk about that as discrepant sexual desire. And yet we don't know enough about discrepant sexual desire. Few of the large population-based surveys have actually looked at how frequent it is. And it turns out to be even more common than low desire, right? So one person has higher desire, the other person has lower, but it's all relative to the other person. So if you imagine the low desire person, let's say her in this instance, if she was in a relationship with another person who desired sex once a year, suddenly her desire is high, right? So you can see the challenges in trying to only treat low desire from a single person's point of view.
And what's normal, yeah.
And what's normal, right? And so my preference is always to address this, if the person's in a relationship, is to address this from a relational perspective.
You've been at this for a long time. How common is low desire? Because I think some people might see themselves in Sarah, the example we gave, while other people might think, well, she's the exception.
Right. Yeah. So thanks to the approval of Viagra in 1998, that was really the start of researchers asking this question: how common is low desire? And if you're wondering, why did desire lead to the start of studying women's sexuality, there was a real interest in trying to determine whether Viagra could work for women in the same way that it was a blockbuster medication for men. So it kind of launched a number of these very large population-based studies. There's one in the US, there's one in the UK, there have been many throughout different parts of Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. And all of the studies tend to converge on this number of around 30%, 30 to 40% of women will say that over the past year, I've had a period of at least 3 months or more where I've had either low or absent desire.
Wow, that's a huge percentage.
Huge percentage. And in fact, the large study that was published right on the heels of Viagra was called Sexual Problems in the United States. And it was published by Laumann in 1999. And in the abstract, which is the summary of the paper, it said 43% of women have sexual dysfunction. And that figure just took off. And unfortunately, it's a bit inflated because in that particular study, what they didn't follow up with is And does your low desire bother you, right? So yes, the numbers are pretty high, but not every person who has low desire is bothered by it or distressed by it, right? So if you're going through a particularly stressful period of life,
Yeah.
or you're in the postpartum, or so there's some other explanation, you're not necessarily distressed. So when we factor in distress, those numbers come down just a little bit, but still it's about a third of women across ages.
What was shocking to me, I mean, I had to do a double take on this. It seems like lower desire actually appears to be more common in younger women than older women, because like the thought is like, oh, okay, you age and you're just gonna, and you're in a relationship for a long time, but that's seems not to be the case.
So let's take a step back.
Yeah.
And, one of the complexities of desire is how are you measuring it?
Yeah.
Right? So the studies that have tended to show that it was higher in younger women have asked two questions. What is your intensity of desire? And what is your frequency of desire? So if you kind of think about that question for yourself, what does it mean if I only think about desire, 10 minutes a day in a 24-hour day? I would actually be scored quite low on that. Or if I only thought about, desire twice a week as opposed to 7 days a week, I would score quite low. So these studies that show these kind of interesting patterns of young women have lower desire than older women, they tend to use more of these kind of crude measures of desire compared to studies that ask about desire in a much more kind of nuanced way. Like when you're having sex, how much desire do you have? Or when you're being intentional about fantasies, how much desire do you have? So once we put that aside, the measurement issue, but it really is a big, big issue. What we find is that distress about low desire tends to go down with age, right? So at around perimenopause, menopause, which is early 50s, women who report low desire suddenly become less distressed about it. So you see this sort of drop off. So indeed, we do see higher rates of low desire in pre and perimenopausal women as compared to postmenopausal women.
There was this fascinating study, I think it was in Germany, and it's probably 20 years old at this point, but, and researching this, I came across it, but it seemed like women, like in long-term relationships, like with each decade that goes by, the chances that they would have low desire would accelerate. Does that line up with things that you have seen?
Yeah. So, I mean, clinically, and keep in mind that a sex therapist is going to see a very narrow slice of this population, right?
Yeah.
It's the people who have low desire, who are distressed by it, have the means to ask for help. And in fact, less than 15% of women with low desire ever speak with anyone about their low desire. And that might be another conversation we have around what do we do in that situation to help people who are suffering in silence. So if we look at, indeed, among the people that I see, well, no, actually, I'm going to contradict myself and say I do see a lot of low desire in young women, but I'd say that the contributors are quite different, right? So in young women, I tend to see a lot more anxiety, depression, body image, fears of performance failure, things like that. And then with age, we see more contributors from medical health, perimenopause, fatigue, sleep disruption, all of those other things as well.
Why does it seem like this is more of a thing that comes up with women rather than men?
Low desire?
Yeah.
So interesting question. And indeed, the large studies that I was just referencing moments ago have also asked about low desire in men. And consistently, they find the prevalence to be about half the prevalence.
Half.
Yeah. So
that's significant.
That 43% figure that I mentioned earlier, that same study found low desire in men was at the most 20%. And so this question of why there's sex differences and there's gender differences. Those are two different things, right? So when we think about sex, we think of assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth. We think about what's the role of hormones, physiology, biology, all of those factors. And from that perspective, we know that testosterone plays a big role, right? So birth assigned males have about 10 times the level of testosterone than birth assigned females do. And I should say, this is not in the context of gender affirming hormone therapy, right? So this is remove hormones from the equation. So the biological push towards desire is far stronger in males than it is in females. Then you look at it from a gender perspective, and here's maybe where we're comparing men, women, gender diverse people, gender non-binary people. And we have a long legacy of paternalistic views towards women's sexuality. So if you think back, the 1800s when Freud was classifying sexual dysfunctions, women with high desire were labeled as nymphomaniac, and women with low desire were labeled as frigid. And those terms were reserved for women exclusively, right? So there was this no middle ground of women enjoying their sexuality, embodying their sexuality. Nope, it was either too high or too low. And, fast forward, of course, 150 years, and we don't have those labels anymore, but I think there's still a legacy of those labels. So that's also contributing. So sex differences and gender differences that contribute to probably why we see such higher levels of sexual problems in women.
Yeah, I mean, I think to get into the middle of it, I think, so if this is widespread, then it seems to me that, understanding female desire is essential if you want to have a good sex life over a lifetime. And so I want to pinpoint some of the forces underneath this. And so if we started with like context around sex to begin with, I think a lot of people they idealize this version of desire where, oh my God, I see someone that I'm attracted to. Oh my God, I'm so turned on, so horny right now. Like, let's just do it. And like, I mean, I even saw a quote like last night on a talk show or something. It was basically like, if you don't have that, then there's like something wrong with you. I think it was a male talk show, but yeah. And so sex just happens like effortlessly. Yeah. So from what I could gather in the scientific literature, that that's often called spontaneous desire. So what's sort of incomplete about that picture?
Yeah. So it certainly is the kind of view of desire that gets perpetuated in mainstream media and pretty much in everything, in songs and artwork, et cetera. And it's this idea, as you said, that you see someone, you're attracted to them, and you want to have sex with them. And then if it does lead to a sexual encounter, it leads to arousal, probably orgasm, probably simultaneous orgasm in both people. And then there's, this kind of resolution period afterwards. And not that form of desire doesn't exist, but if it does exist, it tends to be more prevalent in the early stages of a relationship when everything's novel and new, and you rely more on dopamine centers, which is the reward center of the brain. And what happens over time as things become less novel is it gets replaced with familiarity and also an entirely different system of the brain that's involved in desire. And so if you are someone who that is sort of the gold standard of what desire should look like, when that, quote, normally starts to fade, you start to question your own desire. And am I broken? Have I lost it? Will it come back? And you mourn for it. And if there's a mismatch also in the relationship, maybe the other person's spontaneous desire hasn't decreased to the same degree that yours has, then of course it can create tension in the relationship. So thankfully, it's not the only kind of desire. It's a form of desire that, again, if it's present, tends to be more likely in the early stages, but it gets replaced with a responsive kind of desire. And it's the desire that it's not that you see the person from across the street, you have attraction, and then you get desire and it proceeds on to arousal, but rather that relationship gets flipped. So you consent to and agree to and initiate or are receptive to a person's initiation of sex. And then arousal is what leads to desire afterwards. So it's arousal first and then desire secondly. And there's lots of analogies you can think of. I mean, I love gym analogies. It's like that analogy of, you go to the gym because it's good for your heart or you want to cushion your bones with muscle. And then halfway through, when the endorphins kick in, you say, oh, thank goodness I'm here. And certainly by the end of the workout, you say, can't wait for the next time. Yeah. And then, of course, the next time arrives and You're staring at your runners and you're dreading putting them on. This started out as kind of a theory that was based on clinical observation.
Yeah.
And in the last 2 decades, if not more, there's been a lot of empirical science that has supported this. And in turn, it's led to a lot of people feeling not so broken about their diminished spontaneous desire.
What happens if two people go into a relationship and, especially the woman, if they don't have this sustained sort of desire, if they think that spontaneous desire is the norm, like that's all there is?
If one person has that spontaneous desire and it goes down and the other person, is deeply concerned about it, they're going to start to question the relationship, or they're going to start to question, again, all of the things that Sarah talked about earlier, right? So are you the right person for me? Am I broken? Do I need a pill to fix this, et cetera? As opposed to if I were to see that couple in my office, I would really focus much more on arousal. So what are the things that we can put in place to elicit arousal for you, which in turn would trigger that wanting, trigger that motivation? And sometimes for people, they don't know what those things are because they've kind of been riding that spontaneous desire wave for so long. They don't necessarily pay attention to the things that turn them on because they're so automatic. And so then it becomes much more of a conversation around, what are those things? And do you know what those things are? Does your partner know what those things are? Can we inject some curiosity and creativity into figuring out the things that turn you on, which would more reliably pave the way for desire then?
So, playing into just a classical stereotype for a minute. So if I'm just understanding you correctly, so like spontaneous desire is basically like, I don't know, a man sees his wife naked, come out of the shower, all of a sudden he's like turned on and he's just ready to go. And then,
great example.
And then she's coming out and then feels that, but she's like, I'm like not in the mood at all to do this.
Yeah.
Which maybe is not for the rest of the night, but if she does potentially decide to do it, responsive desire would basically mean at some point during the encounter, she would then get aroused and potentially enjoy the experience.
Right. Okay. But we still haven't addressed the question, how does she get from standing there, neutral, undressed, to that point of being aroused and subsequent desire? And that this has also been a place of a lot of really sophisticated research that has focused on how do people kind of move out of that place of neutral towards being either receptive to that naked partner who has spontaneous desire, or initiating on their own. And here's where, we really need to focus on, well, what are your reasons for sexual activity? And this research is borrowed from other research that looks at motivated behavior in general. So the approach avoidance model, which suggests that we engage in behaviors either because we're going to get something good out of it, an approach behavior, or we're trying to avoid something bad, right? So for this woman standing there and her partner's sort of ready to go and inviting her, if her reasons are, well, I'm not excited right now, I don't have desire right now, but I know on the other side of this, I'll have an orgasm. There'll be pleasure for me. This is great for our relationship. We're on vacation and kids are nowhere to be found and I don't need to do laundry and it's going to be relaxing for me. So in other words, a whole list of things that she's going to get out of this, then that would move her from neutral towards being receptive. If, on the other hand, her reasons are exclusively to avoid something bad, right? So to avoid tension in the relationship, avoid a fight, avoid an angry partner, avoid something else, that's a direct pathway to resentment, right? That would be, with that couple, I would actually advise couples therapy. Not even sex therapy, but couples therapy, sort of look at communication styles and is the higher desire person kind of holding the relationship hostage in a way by creating this kind of I need this and otherwise I'm going to be really difficult to be around. And in sex therapy, it means we spend a lot of time talking about and exploring people's motivations for sex. And for people that don't have any, guess what? We start with a list. So there's about 237 different reasons for sex. And I would hand someone a list of, a distilled down version, 50 reasons, and invite them to look at the list and think about, could any of these reasons, align with your own values? Could they be reasons that you maybe try on or try out in a certain encounter? And then we go from there.
Yeah, I think the big point that emerges for me here is, it might not even necessarily be like, should we have sex coming out, like we have these two types of desires, but it's more of like the pathologizing of she did not respond the same way. And so something's wrong with her because she's not like responding the same way when it seems like that's like completely normal response.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you could break this down by percentage, but like what percentage of men have sort of a more spontaneous oriented desire and what percentage of women have that versus responsive?
Yeah. So rather than looking at it from percentage of people, it's much more a feature of relationship duration. So even those women who 100% of the time they have spontaneous desire in the early stage of a relationship, many, if not most of them, will move towards a more responsive pattern as the relationship continues on. Now, of course, there's exceptions, right?
Yeah.
So, if you think of kind of a bell-shaped curve where different people kind of fall along at different places along that bell-shaped curve, there's always going to be about 10% of women on the far right-hand side, those women who really rely on their spontaneous desire to initiate sex. And then there's going to be about 85% of women right in the middle, right? Those people that might experience spontaneous desire in the early stages and then move to more responsive. And then there's going to be about 5 to 10% of women who never feel spontaneous desire. And maybe it relates to their biology, their physiology, et cetera. And they will only ever relate to that kind of pattern of responsive desire. And so that same bell-shaped curve you can apply to men and males. But the difference here, again, is testosterone, where they're far more likely to have that kind of physical feeling of wanting, that lust, that, feeling deep within them that triggers desire for them. But even testosterone declines. So it declines with every decade of life in a male, but it tends not to hit a level that becomes clinically significant until men are in their, late 50s, 60s and beyond. And that's when they start to have erection problems and maybe their desire starts to go down then.
It's interesting, not just related to sex, but the overall relationship. It's like, I wonder how many people based their decisions on basically everything around how does this person make me feel in general around in the first year, just the relationship in general. And then also this intoxicating type of feeling when it comes to sex. And then it's like, if you're basing your entire relationship off of that first feeling and like it doesn't last that way, it seems like people genuinely believe that it will last and then mourn that.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you use the word mourn because that's a word I often use in the clinical setting as well. And I would say, of the couples with low desire that I see more often, it's the people who started out with the fiery, spontaneous desire pattern. And so fast forward some months or years or decades, that change from such a fiery, visceral desire to now something that's a slow burn is it feels like they've lost something and they're mourning that versus the people that have always had that kind of slow burning desire. I think that those folks are probably less likely to seek a sex therapist.
It's like people's deepest fear is like feeling like you're like a roommate.
Yeah, it sure
like
is.
with your spouse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Unless there's pain. And then those couples are quite grateful. Well, it depends on who has the pain, but they are able to adapt to those decreases in desire much more if there's finally a reason to not engage in painful sex anymore.
The second piece of this, I think that's interesting, is what's called the dual control model of sexual response. So, like the baseline, I guess, you feel turned on or something. So can you explain how that factors into all of this?
Yeah, so dual control model. So this was Eric Janssen and John Bancroft, who really synthesized a lot of the research that looked at motivated sexual behavior. And they also looked at it in the context of, people engaging in unsafe sex. So, not using condoms, et cetera. And they looked at it in the context of sexual problems, et cetera. And what they surmised was that there are two systems that control sexual behavior. So it's not a model of desire per se, it's more a model of sexual behavior. And it indicates, and there's since been a lot of scientific research that has really substantiated this theory, that there's an excitatory model or an excitatory system in our brain. And so that's the system that responds to positive cues. So seeing someone who's attractive, the possibility of an orgasm, having something that really turns you on, erotica, different fantasies, etc. Those would be part of the excitatory pathway, things that turn you on. And then at the same time, there's this inhibitory pathway that turns the whole system off. And so if you think about it, a person who doesn't have an inhibitory system is probably going to be engaging in unsafe sexual activity. And that was certainly the theory that they put forward was, an unopposed, highly excitatory system means that you're having sex with anyone, with everyone. You're not thinking about condoms. You're not thinking about potential harms, et cetera. And so that inhibitory system is not necessarily a bad thing. It serves to regulate the excitatory system. Mm-hmm. But if you think about someone with low desire, right, they, on the other hand, would have that kind of high inhibitory system, lots of things that turn it off. So fear of body image, depression, anxiety, fear of performance failure. And their excitatory system is similarly, is also not high. So it's not counterbalanced. And when we see someone with low desire, so often sex therapists or sex therapy in general have focused on how do we excite the system more? Do we need to teach them how to fantasize? Do we need to make sure that they know how to touch themselves and a partner knows how to touch them to further excite the system? But more often than not, the problem is with the inhibitory system. So
the turn-offs, yeah.
If you think about the kind of gas pedal, brake pedal analogy that Emily Nagoski articulated so well in her book, Come As You Are, which was based on the dual control model. And it suggests that, again, people with low desire, they're just hammering on the brakes, mm-hmm. and as opposed to, touching the gas pedal. And so we need to teach that person, how do you let go of some of those inhibitions? How do we lessen the impact of anxiety and depression and body image and fears and all of the other things that are inhibiting your sexual activity?
What would you say are some examples of turn-on cues or turn-off cues?
So turn-on cues would be erotica. So that's kind of a clear example of an excitatory cue.
Yeah.
An inhibitory cue would be depression, right? So depression, which is characterized not just by low mood and sadness, but also by apathy. The things that used to excite me no longer excite me. And there's both kind of an environmental component to depression, and there's definitely a biological component to it that puts the brake pedal on. And so again, you can see how before we set out to help someone with their low desire, we need to really understand, okay, is it that they're not pressing the gas enough, or is it that they're pressing the brake pedal far too much?
I can imagine a scenario where let's just say there's a lot of stress, right? And so for one person, that stress, the kids and the responsibilities, and I'm caring for my ailing parent, and so many different things. I'm so stressed, and then there's so many turnoffs, and so it's the last thing I'll ever think about is sex. But for some reason, it seems like another person might take the stress, and then sex is the outlet, and they get more turned on because they're stressed. Why does that happen?
Yeah, and the dual control model can be really, really helpful here.
Yeah.
And Bancroft and Janssen actually wrote about this, and not in the context of stress, but in the context of depression, because there's a higher proportion of males that actually have an increase in their desire and an increase in sexual behavior when they are depressed.
Wow.
Right? So you're sort of thinking about sex as a coping mechanism to deal with depression. There's probably also an underlying physiological reason as well, where it relates to more activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which can be interpreted as higher desire. But let's get back to the scenario that you presented, which is, one person says, I can't possibly think about sex when I have a never-ending to-do list, and this is yet another item on a to-do list that I've barely touched today. And the other person says, yes, but in order to get through the to-do list, sex puts me in a place where I feel clear and I feel less stressed, and it's a way to connect, and et cetera. And that presents a dilemma.
Yeah.
If you have two people for whom stress has opposing effects on sexual activity. And so it's kind of what makes sex therapy fun, is how do you take the same thing that has opposite effects on two different people in a couple?
What have you learned about women who have like the most sensitive breaks, quote unquote?
What have I learned from them is oftentimes there are a multitude of different factors that are contributing to those inhibitions. So at a very surface level, first thing we look at is depression and anxiety, right? And it's rarely just that. Those are fairly easy, and I don't mean to be flippant in saying that, because anxiety and depression can be very, very distressing, and even life-threatening for a lot of people. But they're also relatively easy to address in the context of low desire. It's when we try and understand, are there other factors that are not so apparent at the surface, things that our questionnaires don't measure or standardized batteries are not assessing. So things like differences in, let's say, how the couple handle household chores, right? And this has also been an area that comes up a heck of a lot in sex therapy, is, let's say, in the context of a opposite sex couple, where she feels like she's carrying the lion's share of all of the domestic chores and activities and caring for kids and working, et cetera. And her desire is directly correlated with how little her partner is doing, right? And that can be a really difficult thing to come up. And it's often something that does not come up spontaneously in the context of sex therapy. But of course, with some good questioning, you can uncover. And then you start to find out that actually her having to caretake even for her partner makes it an unsexy relationship. It sort of feels like she's caretaking yet another child.
Yeah.
Right. And so that dynamic between what is your role as lover and now who you are to me as a child can absolutely squash desire.
Yeah, I think together, like understanding the spontaneous and the responsive desire, and then these turn-ons and turn-offs, I think already gives people a language and system for like understanding what's going on. There was a story in your book that really hit me, because I think it shows how dire this can feel when someone doesn't understand those breaks or things that are like turning them off. And so Cynthia, she's a woman in her 50s, but then stress entered the picture, and the way she interpreted her loss of desire was devastating. So you wrote in your book, you said, Cynthia had always enjoyed sex. She was easily aroused and regularly reached orgasm during sex, and she loved the feelings of pleasure that surged through her body. But in the span of a year, Cynthia went from having sex once or twice a week to only once in the past 3 months. Furthermore, she did not miss it. Cynthia interpreted her loss of a desire as yet another failure on her part, and suggested to her husband that he might consider seeing a sex worker, given that she could not imagine wanting to have sex again. Yeah. And so why does like, I don't miss it, I don't feel it, feel so frightening to people?
Yeah. Yeah. So Cynthia also, I recall she went through a period of depression.
Yeah.
Where suddenly that apathy that we talked about earlier, it started out apathy for hobbies and activities that she really loved. I think it was dancing with her. And then with time, it generalized to sex as well. And so that kind of catastrophic thinking that you've just said out loud that I wrote about in my book, this feeling of, oh, it's not just the sexual encounter that I'm not enjoying. It means that I'll never enjoy it again. I'll never get it back. And it's kind of a classic picture of apathy, right? How can I thirst for and crave something that I used to crave when right now there's nothing that I'm enjoying. And so that is the case for a lot of women. And also we also know that depression and that kind of catastrophic thinking, negative thinking, predictions in the future of this kind of bleak picture of sexual desire characterizes a certain number of women's low sexual desire. And it means that you kind of need to address both of those at the same time. Well, not just both. There's multiple things. There's the depressed mood, but there's also that tendency to say it's never going to be the way it was before. And, I think for people also that maybe have had an easier pattern of desire and arousal, it took less effort. So maybe Cynthia is someone who's on that kind of right hand of that distribution curve that I mentioned, where touches would easily excite her. And now in a period of depression, the same touch, as she would say, feels like my partner's touching my elbow. It doesn't have that same quality of pleasure, of tingling as it did. And that combined with this tendency to have this catastrophic thinking means that you feel so stuck and you can't imagine a way out of it.
I can imagine that. I mean, most people, maybe they'll talk about their relationship in general to friends or someone that's close to them. But I don't know how many people like share the details of what's going on in their sex life to other people.
Yeah.
And so like, maybe you're not even communicating with your partner or spouse or whatever, but then you also have no outlet. Yep. And so then when I read a story, like such an extreme intervention of like, maybe you should see a sex worker, especially given the history of like, we were having sex multiple times a week. I was this pleasure and okay, I don't feel this. Maybe you should see it. Like, how does someone get to such an extreme place?
Yeah. And I think we can ask that question when we're not depressed.
Yeah.
When we're not plagued with this sort of black and white thinking, this bleak thinking. But for the person who is in that position, they can't imagine, given the extent of, their apathy, the fact that flame of desire has not just dwindled, it's completely absent for them. The kinds of touches that used to be so exciting, they feel absolutely nothing for. And so it's almost impossible to imagine. And so the only option then, if we're going to stay together, is to give partner another outlet, right? So it is absolutely extreme. And partners often saying, what are you talking about? We can get back there and we just need to figure out the steps to get there. And often in this kind of a situation, it's a partner who is more likely to, want to pursue the sex therapy. Because for someone like Cynthia in this instance, she's convinced that her sex life is over.
So if someone's listening who maybe they don't relate to the sex worker thing, but they relate to some part of that story, what would you want them to know before they turn it into a story of failure or should take some sort of extreme intervention?
Yeah, I mean, I think the quick answer, which is desire is extremely flexible. And we know based on a lot of research and even more clinical experience that people wax and wane in their feelings of desire over the course of a lifespan. We also know that we have several evidence-based treatments to help people elicit sexual desire again. And then I think at a very high level is saying to someone that, look, you're not alone, that there are plenty of people who've been exactly in that same place that you are in right now, and they've been able to recreate desire. And in some cases, in a better way afterwards than it was before.
A lot of what we've been talking about is up until this point, like what's happening sort of inside a person, like, their desire, their breaks. But, I also do want to talk about the actual relationship itself when it comes to why somebody might have low desire being an issue and how like the relationship itself could become like one of the breaks.
Yeah.
And so there's another story that you tell of a client named Shalina that I think really articulates this. The detail that I got most was like, so she had planned sex between 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. every Friday. And then you wrote she longed for the physical cravings she used to experience for sex that had been replaced by an orchestrated plan and predictable outcome.
Yeah.
And so how do you distinguish between a woman who just has low desire, and then a woman who is like becoming bored of like the actual relationship dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's funny, when we ask people, which has been done many, many times in large research studies, tell me about the context of your sexual activity. When does it happen? Where does it happen? For a lot of people, it's quite mundane. For a lot of couples who have jobs and children and other responsibilities, it tends to be late at night, maybe I always say after the 11 o'clock news. And it follows a very, very predictable pattern. There's the same set of ritualistic touches and exchanges that happen. And it usually will result in some kind of intercourse, let's say in a heterosexual couple, but even in a same-sex couple, it'll involve some kind of sexual penetration of sorts. And when we don't question that, and yet we know that sexual desire, there's an energy expenditure that comes along, not just with desire, but with sexual activity as well. So when you start to talk to people about planning sex, well, the first thing they say when you raise the possibility of planning sex, usually 9 times out of 10, they'll say, doesn't that make it mechanical and clinical and boring? To which I always reply, what else do you do in your life that you enjoy, that's of value, that's unplanned? And then they pause and they say, oh yeah, you're right. The dinner parties, the outings, the different things, everything is planned and has intention around that. And so in the case of Shalina, it would actually involve scheduling it, planning it for a time that's not late at night. That's not after, she's tended to 100 different things and there's no gas in the tank left. And it's also planned with the intention of making sure that the two of them are doing things that are actually arousing for her, as opposed to skipping all of the arousing things and going straight to intercourse.
I'd imagine for like the spontaneous partner, do they like the fact of like scheduling sex or no?
I think what they like about it is that sex will happen.
Yeah.
Right. And so often the higher desire partner knows that it's become unrewarding for their partner. And so, again, most of the time, not always, because there certainly are partners where the main person's pleasure is irrelevant for them. And again, that's sort of a fast track to couples therapy, not even sex therapy. If your partner's pleasure and arousal means nothing to you, we're not going to do sex therapy skills. We're not going to focus on arousal. We're going to focus on why is their pleasure not important to you. So typically the higher desire person is willing to go along with the kind of scheduled sex because it means sex is going to happen.
Yeah.
And especially if it means that the lower desire partner is going to show up more, right? They're going to be engaging in the kinds of things that feel good, which of course are going to feel good for the other person as well.
Why did the scheduling for her, or even somebody like her, right? So if you know exactly when it's going to happen, how long it's going to last, how it's going to end, like why would that seem to produce a negative outlook? So I guess essentially the question is like, what's the difference between scheduled sex that actually is like fun and pleasurable versus something that becomes very boring for people? Yeah,
it could become boring or even anxiety provoking. So for someone who has a lot of anxiety, that degree of advanced scheduling can actually backfire, right? So it's so individual as well. I'd say on the whole, scheduling sex for most couples, not 100% of the time, but for busy couples who have other responsibilities, scheduling sex is going to be not just important, I would argue probably even necessary. If you are someone who has a lot of anxiety and that degree of advanced scheduling creates a whole other set of worries, performance fears, what's going to happen that day, then what I say is maybe you could do sort of a hybrid between spontaneity and planning. Like, could you wake up in the morning and maybe plan it for that day as opposed to planning it for a week from now? But in an ideal scenario, what the advanced planning allows someone to do is to fantasize, to make sure that it's happening at a time when other distractions are minimized. So, if there are kids in the house, maybe they're watching a movie, maybe they're with a babysitter. The dog is not in the bedroom. Oh my gosh, these low desire couples, how often is the dog in the bedroom with them on the bed? And I sometimes feel like it's silly that I have to point out the detrimental effects of having the dog in the bedroom. And they say, oh, and then of course put the dog out.
I don't know who could get turned on with that. No, seriously.
Yeah. You and me both question that. So I think the fantasy, the planning, the bathing ahead of time, and that's also another topic that a lot of couples find uncomfortable to talk about, is the impact of odors that turn them off. And they don't want to hurt a partner's feelings by saying, actually, the smells that are coming up, even in the context of touch that feels really, really good, acts as an inhibitor, right? So I, as a sex therapist, can talk about bathing and, mouthwash and things like that, because then it doesn't feel like one partner is outing another partner.
Do people just ignore that in the beginning of a relationship?
They do. And again, because dopamine is so strong and the excitatory factors are so strong that they kind of overpower some of those exact same inhibitory factors that can dominate the sexual encounter later on.
So I think the question becomes does a prolonged period of predictability, not just predictability, but also familiarity with one person, does that automatically lead to feeling like sexually dead inside or reduced desire? What would you say about that?
Yeah. So, brilliant people like Esther Perel have kind of forwarded this idea that in a long-term relationship with familiarity and comfort and dependability, you always automatically sacrifice sexual desire. And I think that narrative is a really important one because it helps people think about why their desire might decline over the course of a relationship. But this has actually been an area of a lot of intense science as well more recently that suggests it's not quite that simple. It's actually a lot more nuanced. And if familiarity and the kind of, relatedness happens also in the context of differentiation, then that's a good thing. So in other words, you can be in a very, very long-term relationship, but if there is also a sense of separateness, the two of you have separate maybe activities, separate identities, and there's an added value, if you will, of the sexual encounter that the person brings, then that familiarity is not necessarily a bad thing for low sexual desire. So great work done by Amy Muse out of Ontario in Canada that has tracked this in couples as she follows them over the long term, but has also really looked at across different studies. How do you kind of reconcile the fact that there are people who are in very long-term relationships who are very, very close that might still report the best sex of their life? And again, that seems like that differentiation is the critical factor.
Now, help me understand that, because some people might hear differentiation and they might think, okay, I'm away from my spouse all day at work. We're completely separate. We're like ships in the night. And so we have a lot of separation, but that doesn't necessarily mean when they come together that sparks a fire.
Yeah. So differentiation isn't just the number of hours in a day that you see a person. It relates more to identity, right? So if you have a partner if the two people in a relationship have different activities that are totally separate, where you can watch that person engaging in their activities that you're not involved in whatsoever, that's where that kind of differentiation comes in, and that can really bolster sexual desire. Now, on the other hand, we also found that during COVID, when people were spending a lot of time together, and it was so interesting when you look back at the initial media reports and predictions, there was, a prediction, if you remember early on, that there would be a baby boom within 9 months of March 2020. Guess what? The opposite happened. We saw sky-high levels of relationship breakup, higher levels of divorce than pre-pandemic, and it's because people were spending way too much time together and were not differentiated at all.
So that's fascinating, by the way. Yeah, I remember when that came out and people were talking about the baby boom that was going to happen. So what is it about differentiation then that leads to that? So
it's here's where, if we come back to some of the writing of Esther Perel, where she says, desire isn't something you feel, it's a place you go, right? So in that space, in that kind of differentiated space where I sense I am separate from you. I have my own identity and you have your own identity. Then it creates that almost curiosity where I can step into that space and go to where you are because it's a part of you I don't know, right? And so it still has that nature of seeking out, wanting to be curious, wanting to kind of understand. There's some mystery there. Again, even in the context where there's so much that's already familiar.
So is that because it activates novelty in some sort of way?
It can also activate a feeling of admiration. It can activate feelings of, love, of wonder, of mystery. There's all sorts of feelings that it can activate. And it turns out all of those feelings are actually really, really good for sexual desire and map onto what is happening with spontaneous desire early on in a relationship. So it becomes more a question of how do we cultivate this, place of curiosity and novelty, newness, even within a very long-term relationship.
So for me, I think what is interesting is that I'd imagine that, so there's a difference between like, okay, you're differentiated and you have your own lives and you're kind of like stepping into each other's worlds, but then there must be like a shared world that you're coming back to, which is that the difference between the ships in the night thing? Because if you have your separate worlds and then you never see the person, and like, I never see you, you're always at work, you're always over there, but there's no shared world to cut back. Is that the difference?
Yeah. And in a sexual encounter, we want people to be in the same place at the same time, barring fantasies, of course. And that's, there's certainly a role for fantasies. But when we look at people who report, exquisite, blissful sexual encounters, they're fully present with their partner in the here and now. And so absolutely there's a need for those two ships passing in the night to have this space and this time where they're fully in the present, fully in sync, and fully aligned with the other person.
One thing that came up with Stephen Snyder when he was on the podcast is he was saying this from his clinical observation, but he was saying that like many women don't just want sex, and they don't just want to be loved, but they want to feel like consumed. And he used this funny analogy of like a croissant, they want to be consumed like a croissant. And so it's like this idea that a woman often wants to feel like animalistic desire from her, and this is a straight relationship, but like a male partner, like I have to have you. What's your take on that? Like, how important is the experience of like being like deeply, like urgently wanted?
Yeah, I would say it's critically important for some people, and it's completely meaningless for others. And in fact, some women will say that feeling of my partner wanting me is like yet another item on my to-do list, that, they're wanting me and I have to take care of their need and their want, and then put a check mark on the to-do list. But let's suppose we're talking about the first person, that feeling of being desired for some women, that is really at the heart of their desire. So when I feel like I'm at the center of my partner's attention, where they would do anything to have access to me, where they would, scale a mountain in order to be with me, for some women, that's a really critical key that unlocks their sexual desire. If we come back to the dual control model, that's an excitatory factor, right? So when they sense that paves the way for her wanting. And then, like I said, for other women, it can have the opposite effect. And still for others, it has no impact whatsoever. And I think what this highlights is just how nuanced sexual desire is. It's not the same thing for every person, nor is it the same for one person at every stage of their life and with every partner.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because you see a lot of content about sex online and people are trying to understand themselves. And it's just like everything is like so nuanced. And so like, I think the generalizations can like help to a point, if it identifies potentially large groups of people, but then there's just like rabbit holes that deviate in every direction.
Yeah, it's also why, Matthew, our diagnoses of, desire disorder are number one, highly problematic, and number two, have evolved so much in the last 15 years. And so historically, if you were using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of mental disorders, you would diagnose someone with a sexual desire disorder if they had no desire.
No.
But there was no kind of fulsome, nuanced description of what desire is and therefore what low desire is. And so in newer versions of the DSM, like the DSM-5, there's an opportunity to think about desire in a what we call polythetic way. So, if a person has 3 of 6 criteria, so maybe they desire sex less and they're not initiating and they feel less pleasure and there's distress. But in the next person, it may be, well, they're not responsive to erotica anymore and they don't fantasize about sex anymore. So their desire and therefore their low desire shows up quite differently. So you're absolutely right that if we kind of walk away with a singular notion of what desire is for all genders, for all sexes, and for a person throughout their life, it inadvertently leads to a lot of people feeling broken.
On the example of a woman wanting her man to desire her, is there a difference between, because I can imagine a lot of men hearing something like that and being like, yes, I do want her. Is there a difference between wanting just the sex, between like, I want you? Is there a distinction there?
Yeah. So most of the kind of writing and theorizing on this is that it is the latter. It is that I want you, not necessarily the sex we're having, because that could be with another person.
Yeah.
But it's you that I want. There's something very, very unique and attractive about you that I want, that I'm willing to, again, scale a mountain and take a trip home and do whatever I need to do in order to be with you.
How is that felt though, like experientially for some people? Like if you were to give like a scenario of what that looks like.
So I think it would, well, let's say from the woman for whom that kind of feeling of being wanted is really, really important. She might say, if someone is flirting with me at a party and my partner sees that, my partner will intervene, not out of a place of jealousy, but out of a place of, you're mine and your sexuality belongs to the two of us. So that could be one scenario that it comes up. I think another scenario that I hear about often is what I've just mentioned. So someone who says, I've been away for 3 days. I have 3 more days of my trip. I can't bear to not be with you anymore. I'm canceling the trip and coming home early to have sex with you. So I think there's different ways that it can come up. But I think for the person for whom that feeling of feeling craved in the center of attention is so important, that's really what it communicates, is that I will go the mile to be with you sexually.
I think the question it also raises that we haven't gotten to is like, when you actually start having sex, like what is happening? And like, what is that experience like for her? And so like, so the entire experience of sex, at least culturally, it seems like operates sort of on like a male timeline. And so like the male arousal builds and he orgasms and then like the whole thing is kind of like over. And it seems, I don't know if that's true. Is that like a myth of that's how the structure of sex normally is in an average couple?
Yeah. Well, I that kind of model of sexual desire, which is desire first, then arousal, then orgasm, is certainly a male pattern of sexual response that Masters and Johnson and Kinsey wrote about back in the 50s and 60s. And so it still fits quite well for probably the majority of males, not all, but for the majority of them, where it's desire first, then arousal, orgasm happens, it happens once, and then there's this kind of resolution period afterwards. And for females, it tends to not fit at all.
And so because you mentioned earlier, like we're talking about scheduling sex, and then I think the interesting part is like if you get into the actual sex and she's not enjoying that, and she's like not actually being pleasured. So much has been made about like the orgasm gap as well. So it becomes something that maybe you would dread looking forward toward. Is that part of the literature?
Absolutely. And so it's really interesting, the research that has looked at how long does sex last, right? And it's depending on the study that you read, but in most couples, it lasts somewhere between 11 minutes and 24 minutes. And then what's interesting is those studies that have asked people, how long would you like it to last? And men tend to add about another 5 minutes on, and women add about another 10 to 15 minutes on. And so I think the answer really comes out of that observation. So if women are saying that the sexual duration is too short, what it also communicates is there's insufficient time for arousal, right? And so if they're proceeding to sexual intercourse before she's aroused, it can elicit pain. It's more likely that she's not going to be feeling any pleasure, more likely that she's going to be distracted, more likely that she feels like sex is just for partner and partner's pleasure. And then if you repeat that pattern over the long term, that very well could lead to a mismatch in desire where that couple is now struggling with their sexuality. And so, coming back to, I wish we could do sex education for people where we really normalized a very prolonged heating of the oven period, right? Where we sort of look at what factors need to be in place in order to focus on arousal first. So let's set desire aside. And are you doing the things that actually optimally will sexually arouse you? And we know when you compare males and females take longer to get aroused, that arousal waxes and wanes more. It can start to build and then it comes back down. And so it takes quite a bit longer for females to be aroused. And so if you kind of have this notion of the sexual encounter lasting about 11 minutes, chances are that she's bypassing arousal altogether and going straight to penetration.
It's interesting the 11 minutes to the 24 minutes number. A couple of years ago when Ian Kerner was on our podcast, he brought to my attention a statistic that kind of shocked me. And so he was citing some statistic that was saying that the average man lasts just 2.5 minutes to 6 minutes during sex. Yeah. And so then I was tracking this back to a source, and it didn't seem like there was a stopwatch-based multinational study that found a median intervaginal ejaculation latency time of 5.4 minutes. And so it's like in that range. The range that you're talking about is much longer. And so how do you size those things up?
Yeah, for sure. So that literature that Ian is referring was research that was specifically looking at timing. How do we define premature ejaculation? Right. And so quite literally couples were given stopwatches and they would press it at the start of vaginal insertion and they would stop it once ejaculation happened. And it led to the kind of objective measure of premature ejaculation being around a minute, although now they're saying it's 2 minutes because a minute feels too short and you end up pathologizing a lot of men who ejaculate at 1.5 minutes. And so it's really in that context where you look at, okay, if you take the full range of people, then yes, that ejaculatory interval, basically the time from insertion to ejaculation, was probably about 5 minutes when you looked at kind of the far right-hand side of the graph. But much more recent research that's actually asked couples about the duration of a sexual encounter.
Not just the intercourse.
Start, correct. From the very, very start to the very, very end of it, that's where the studies show somewhere between, there was a Canadian study done by Robin Milhausen that found it was about 11 minutes. And then Debbie Herbenick's work found that it was probably around 24 or so minutes.
Well, what I think is interesting, because if you just go based on, porn movies or popular culture, like set aside like the heating of the oven and all that stuff and the full thing. So if you just isolate on the intercourse part, there is this perception that like you should need to sustain like thrusting and pounding and all sorts of positions for like a half hour, right, for like a really good sexual experience. Do you find that mindset is inhibiting people from having a good sexual experience? Yeah,
it's totally it's totally unrealistic, to be honest, because arousal. Well, first of all, there can just be sheer exhaustion that happens, right? So, what we don't see in porn is people who have mobility issues, or someone with chronic back pain, or the perimenopausal woman who has vaginal dryness that has to stop intercourse halfway through and reapply a lubricant, right? Or they have to change positions because it hurts, or someone has a cramp in their foot or something like that. I wish porn depicted that more often, which is kind of the realistic things that happen during a sexual encounter. So in these longer intervals, 10, 20 minutes, people will stop, right? They'll pause, they'll catch their breath, they'll move to a different position. And this notion of 30 minutes of continuous, and in fact, not just continuous, but increasing intensity sexual activity is highly unrealistic. And so if people are kind of using that as the barometer of their current sex life, then of course they're going to feel broken. So we want to normalize. And in fact, we want to normalize changing positions in order to feel more pleasure, and things like using a lubricant and dealing with the cramping leg and the back pain and other things like that.
Would a woman actually, though, desire that? Like, I'm talking about the pop culture aspect of the 30 minutes and being unrealistic, but like, could a woman actually get bored of sex because that's not happening?
So if this is a woman who is so far from orgasm that just a longer duration of sex is doing absolutely nothing to create more pleasure for her, then the answer is yes. If, on the other hand, this is a woman where there's also simultaneous clitoral stimulation, labial stimulation, which is necessary for her to reach orgasm, then she will quite welcome the longer duration of sexual activity. So again, more nuance.
Yeah, I mean, because so much is, that brings to the question, so much has been made about the orgasm gap. Do you think that's important for women, the orgasm piece, or that feels less important than it would be for men?
So if we come back and look at reasons for sex, so that approach avoidance literature that we talked about earlier, and the 237 reasons that people give for why they have sex, orgasm was definitely in the top 10. It was not in the top 5, though, for women. And so while orgasm is a source of pleasure for a lot of women, it's not, again, if you trust the large surveys that have been done, it's not typically the driving force that lead women to engage in sexual activity. However, its absence, especially if she was orgasmic in the past and there's been a change and she's no longer orgasmic, that can be very distressing for her. And she will absolutely, try to do things to elicit an orgasm for her. So I think it really depends. It's easier in a scenario where a woman says, having an orgasm during sexual activity with my partner is just not something we do. I have an orgasm on my own. I masturbate regularly. That's where I feel that kind of release. And the sort of pleasure that I derive from a partnered interaction is not dependent on me having an orgasm.
Being in the top 10, but like not in the top, I mean, that's still like not at the top of the list. Like,
correct.
So what would be different about a man versus a woman that wouldn't be the primary thing that she would be interested in?
Oh, I think there's lots of reasons. I think, an immediate reason is orgasms, coming back to the orgasm gap, orgasms are far more reliable in males than they are in females, right? So we think about the young boy in the bath who still hasn't connected his erection to sex, but might have an erection from the water on his penis and might even feel, a spontaneous ejaculation and the pleasure that goes along with it. So this kind of notion of an accidental orgasm, you don't hear about accidental orgasms in women. You hear about women, having to really focus, having to use the right kind of stimulation, the proper duration of time, the intention, the lubricant, and then reaching orgasm. And so we could blame anatomical differences for that, but I also think there's a lot of historic cultural reasons that also contribute to that, right? Young girl who maybe is in the bath and feeling some pleasure from the bath water on her clitoris is probably going to be scolded by a parent.
Yeah.
A young boy, probably not, right? It's seen as cute or maybe even expected.
When I first came across this, I mean, the differences between male and females when it comes to this was fascinating to me. I mean, the original like Masters and Johnson's research where you look on the graph and you see like a male like they go up and they peak in the experience and boop, it's like they orgasm and then it's just like straight down.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that a lot of men could relate to that experience of like they're just like totally uninterested in sex or just totally, I mean, not completely turned off, but it's just like not the same as it was 2 seconds ago.
Right.
But for a woman, it was like it was like it could go up like this, and then it wouldn't totally go down to the baseline, but then they could have like a second orgasm and go up, and so is that the current reading of the research after what they found? Is it still like that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the kinds of physiological measures that Masters and Johnson did in a lab are not possible in North America.
Yeah, it's like illegal.
It's like illegal. And I do have a sexual psychophysiology lab where we're not allowed to bring couples in. You can, have a single person in there who's, watching erotica and you measure a physical response. But that aside, we have other ways of trying to understand what happens in the body during sex. And absolutely, those original markings that Masters and Johnson did. And what was so interesting was, they had this kind of one graph that depicted male sexual response, which is exactly as you've described it, Matthew. And then for females, there were all of these different versions. So yes, there was the one where there was like kind of multiple peaks, and there were other ones where it would go up and then arousal would plateau for a long time before it reached a peak. And then there were others still where there was never a peak, where there would be kind of this, plateau of arousal and then it would come down. And that very much still maps onto our understanding of human female sexual response today.
You wrote that one client, Joanna, had never experienced orgasm herself, and she's now 57 years old. How is that possible?
Yeah, so Joanna was, it's interesting now we're having such a conversation about menopause. And Joanna, at the time that I saw Joanna and wrote about her in my book, I didn't sort of think about what would the impact of kind of the conversation we're having now around midlife women's sexuality and the role of menopause, et cetera, is having. But essentially, Joanna was someone who was kind of the perpetual caretaker, right? So caring for elderly parents, caring for, I think she had 4 kids, caring for a partner, taking care of everything. And she hit midlife and kind of hearing about sexual activity and desire from other people, and it was her kids in this case who her kids were adults, of course, not children, talking about their own sexuality. And she sort of came to a place where she said, "Hey, what about me? I've had this kind of lifetime of giving and caretaking, and I never questioned my sexuality, but maybe I don't know what I don't know." And was I missing out all of this time? And so, and again, we're sort of seeing this now with a lot of midlife women saying, I've been in a sexless relationship, or I've been in a relationship where the sexual pleasure has been focused on my partner, and I'm saying no more. I have, 30, 40 years left, and I want to experience my own pleasure.
It's just wild that you could go your entire life and not experience an orgasm. Or is it, maybe, I'm speaking from a male perspective, but I guess like, is that common?
Yeah. So anorgasmia, which is kind of the formal diagnosis, which means absent orgasm, is definitely more common in females than it is in males. Now, of course, what the first sort of conclusion is, well, maybe it's been the wrong kind of stimulation, right? Maybe you just have been doing the wrong things. You've kind of bought into this model that intercourse leads to orgasm, and we know that it doesn't in, 80, 90% of females. And the combination of the right stimulation, a vibrator, et cetera, will allow you to reach orgasm. But we know that for about 10% of females, that even with adequate stimulation, orgasm is not possible. I have a few of them in my practice right now that I'm seeing. And so it's more common than we think. And it is certainly more common in females than males.
Yeah, it's amazing when you dive deeper into some of this stuff, like how many misconceptions and myths there are. I mean, when I first learned that the simultaneous orgasm is like a myth, largely, in the sense that, you see on television or the movies, it's just like intercourse, a bunch of pounding, and then both people moaning, and like just perfectly timed, like exactly at the same moment that they both have an orgasm. And it seems like that is not how it happens for the majority of people. Is that true?
100%. And, the statistic that I just gave you, that 85, 90, probably even higher % of females will not reach orgasm through exclusively vaginal stimulation. And if they do, chances are that there's simultaneous stimulation of the clitoris at the same time. So this notion of simultaneous orgasm in a heterosexual couple through intercourse alone not only is not whatsoever based in science, I think it leads a lot of people to feel really broken if they're not having simultaneous orgasms in their real life sex.
It seems like the within the vagina itself, the pleasure center is that's not there's not it's fibers or something that. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so most of the vagina has no pleasure receptors in it whatsoever. And in contrast, the clitoris, which is, sure, there's the small part, there's the clitoral hood and the clitoral bulb that you see from the outside, but most of the clitoris is below the surface, right? So the vestibular bulbs, the periurethral glands, most of the kind of erectile tissue of the clitoris.
And it's pretty big if you look,
It's huge.
Yeah.
Is all beneath the surface of what's visible to the naked eye. And just as a tip to any listeners, how you can find that is actually stroking beside the vagina. So in between the labia minora, the smaller lips, and labia majora, the fuller lips, the upper lips. Stroking there can actually lead the erectile tissue of the clitoris underneath to fill with blood and can be highly, highly pleasure-filled for women. So yeah, the vagina itself is mostly non-responsive to erotic stimulation.
So I think if we zoom out from everything we discussed, responsive desire, gas and brakes, stress, relationship dynamics, stress itself. I feel like we spent the last hour talking about like why low desire happens.
Yeah.
And so the question that we're kind of left with is like how we should think about it. And because, as we've discussed, like many people experience low desire and then they immediately think something is wrong with them. So is that the right conclusion to take about this?
No, absolutely not. Nothing is wrong with them. What is wrong with them is that they're locked into a belief that they should have desire and change absolutely nothing in their current context. So I think that's where the problem really is.
Yeah, because when diving into work, it's just like how normal all this is and how you even define normal, right? Is like if you were to expect to go through life and then like you wouldn't experience all these things. And plus what I love about your work is like there is so much nuance. If you just like go through everything we just discussed, there's just like so many different things in there. And then it's like we're trying to force one picture of sex universally for like all people as the right way to have sex. And then if that's not happening to you, then
no.
Pathologically something's wrong with your relationship.
Yeah, I'll draw the comparison to something much more medical, which is diabetes, right? We all agree, no matter what part of the world that you live in, whether you're a male or a female who's 20 or 60, a certain blood level of sugar connotes diabetes. We don't have those kinds of objective markers when it comes to sexual desire. And which makes it really, really challenging for someone who says, yes, but is this normal? Or how do I know I'm normal or not normal? When we say, well, it depends. Yeah. And it depends on so many different factors.
So if we get that out of the way, then what do you think low desire is actually asking us to pay attention to?
Yeah. So when there is low desire, it's rarely about the sex, right? And that would be, I think for a person, they're focusing, what is it about the sex that I'm not desiring? And that is important sometimes, right? So if the sex that one is having is not worth having, then that's obviously going to have an impact on sexual desire. And those are all this really simple kind of tactical things that you can do. How do you make things feel more pleasurable? How do you eliminate, again, the gas pedal, brake pedal kind of situation? But often it's not just about that. It's about so much more. It is wrapped up in a person's identity and their mood and their sense of confidence, how much they prioritize pleasure, how much, if they're in a relationship, how much a partner truly values that person's pleasure. And that's why these kinds of, one-size-fits-all approaches, or even some of the medication approaches, really don't go very far in restoring someone's lost desire.
Does desire, I mean, over the course of entire life, like what would you say about desire and seasons and going through seasons?
Yeah, I mean, the only certainty with desire is that it is going to wax and wane. And it can be very, very helpful to kind of, be compassionate. And this is where mindfulness comes in, is compassionate to seasons where desire looks a little bit different than it did before. And an optimism that while desire in the next season might not look the same as it did the season before, there is an opportunity for it to feel, pleasurable again. So kind of adopting this flexible understanding of sexual desire, not as a fixed state, right? Something that is there or is not there, but rather something that can be influenced. And I think we have a much easier time with that notion when it comes to certain emotions, right? We feel happy when we're in a good context, when good things happen to us, when we think happy thoughts, and then happiness is there. And with desire, we so often have this belief that it is either absent or present. Again, this notion of a light switch. So thinking about it more like an emotion can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I want to get into, I mean, we've talked so much about nuance, and I'd imagine that the way you deal with low desire is so nuanced. It depends on, I guess, essentially what's causing it. And so if we backed out the things that we discussed before, the responsive desire picture, like if the issue is someone is simply been expecting spontaneous desire, but they're actually more responsive, how then do you work with that?
Those are the folks that I will see for one session, right? So I'll present to them a circular model of sexual response, which talks about and invites them to think about what their reasons are for sex. I might hand them that list of 50 reasons. We then talk about what are the triggers that reliably elicit arousal for them. And if they don't know what those are, I might give them some homework, or things like sensate focus, which are touching exercises that quite literally teach the couple what feels pleasurable for them. And then really normalize this kind of arousal first, desire second picture. And I'm not being flippant here. I'm being quite honest that for those individuals that it's just about normalizing responsive desire, I'll only see them a couple of sessions, and psychoeducation is sufficient, because they suddenly realize, oh, we can cultivate this, and oh, we can have fun finding ways to get aroused again, and we can play with reasons, and off they go.
Yeah, because I think that we can talk about sex from like a high level, and one thing I've noticed in the comments, just on different episodes, people will bring up these like super specific, like practical scenarios about what's happening to them. And I think that's like where in real life, like that can get to be very frustrating, right? So like, let's just say it's like 9 p.m. And someone not only has responsive desire, but they have a lot of breaks. And so it's like, I'm so tired and I don't want sex. Yeah. And so like, what is someone supposed to do with that? If it's like, if it's 9 p.m. I'm like so tired, I just like don't want to have sex with you right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, let's come back to nuance here. So being open to sex while you're neutral, and yet there's still kind of a feeling of curiosity about it, there's consent there, is very different from being neutral, not wanting sex, resenting it, and therefore only agreeing to appease a partner. Those are two very, very different scenarios. So you almost need to know for yourself, am I a no and curious and can give consent and am, interested in seeing where this could go? Then we would talk about, okay, how do we kind of turn that dimmer light on just a little bit more? How do we kind of kindle that fire by escalating it just a little bit more? versus the person who says, it doesn't matter what kind of stimulation is happening at this time, desire is not accessible to me. So you almost need to know, in that instance, I was going to say what kind of person you are, but it's not what kind of person you are. It's what kind of person are you in that instance, for that period of time. And so this is where, a lot of the homework exercises that we would do with couples in experimenting with different things, like different times of the day and different kinds of stimulation, and experimenting with a new reason for sex and seeing, can that actually feel really good and maybe empowering or maybe even sexy for me to have sex in order to feel powerful, to have sex in order to feel dominant or feel competent, or maybe go to a different identity than who I am right now. And so we almost don't know what the outcome would be without a person or a couple trying it.
So let's just say in typical, let's say the male has spontaneous desire and the female has a responsive desire. Is there a balance there in the relationship of how often you are catering towards someone's desire pattern? Oh,
that's a great question. We want to make sure, of course, over the course of, let's say a year, that there's an equal number of times where, the focus is on one person's patterns, preferences, interests, as there is the other one, because or else, if not, then that resentment will build. And people do keep score, right? People do remember, it's always about your pleasure. It's always when you want to have sex. It's always in the way that you want to. Now they may not keep score totally accurately, because that's also going to be biased a little bit depending on memory and other factors and other things that are happening in the relationship. But again, if we come back to thinking about low desire, not as low desire, but as discrepant desire in a couple, how do you meet in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you can meet in the middle by one person always appeasing the other, both ways. Or you can quite literally meet in the middle, which means half the time it's going to, cater to your pleasures and preferences, and half the time it's going to cater to the others.
Yeah, I mean, you've made a distinction a couple of times, what I think is interesting, because what's the difference between being open to desire? I know I have a responsive pattern, I'm going to be open to it, versus obligating yourself to have sex, which you were talking about could potentially lead to resentment.
Yeah, and I think here's where thinking a little bit more about consent, and maybe a listener is thinking about consent sort of in the, consensual, non-consensual sexual assault kind of scenario. But consent is absolutely important, even in the context of a relationship, even in a long-term relationship. And so when you think about it from that perspective, you start to think of, am I neutral, but there's a certain degree of openness and wanting to go there, and especially when that consent is combined with curiosity. Mm-hmm. I'm curious where this might go, versus I don't want this to go anywhere. I'm not curious whatsoever. And this is a no is a no. And it might seem like a gray zone, and it is a gray zone for people, and especially for couples that have not talked about this, right? Like that notion of sexual neutrality yet openness. Well, how do we note that sexual neutrality and unopenness, right? And until we start to have these conversations more openly with couples where they're paying a lot more attention to what things actually feel like in the moment, again, doing away from this idea that things are automatic and effortless, et cetera, and actually really noticing, what does openness feel like in my body? Mm-hmm. What does curiosity feel like in my body? So that I know when to identify it, should it be there in the future.
Yeah, because I imagine there's a lot of friction between people. One of the things that seems to come up in the comments the most, I see the resentment, things that people will comment and be like, well, my wife has responsive desire and she says the same thing to me every single night. And it's just a chronic not openness. And then maybe she's complaining about the exact same thing. So it seems like there's this this gridlock that people are at, where they are stuck in their desire patterns. And especially if she feels low desire too, it's almost like a hopelessness and resentment towards one another.
Yeah. So I'd want to find out from her what would make it worth having, right? What would need to be different, not just in the sex, but in the relationship. in order for there to be some value in this for her to kind of step outside of that gridlocked neutrality towards openness. But if she can't identify even a single reason to make it worth it, it becomes one of those avoidance reasons, right? And that clear pathway to resentment. So I'd want to spend a lot more time talking about communication patterns and other kind of trust and other facets of the relationship before we pursued sex therapy.
Yeah. What if the issue is just life itself? And what I mean by that is like, okay, so someone has a responsive desire pattern, and so they're not just naturally getting turned on. But then we factor in the brakes and the gas pedal thing. It's like, let's just say the amount of brakes are like an entire grocery list of brakes.
Slamming on those
just,
brakes.
Right? So it's like every single possible thing. And it's like, and for some people, it's like, oh, I don't even know what can we change about our life? Like our kids are acting this way. So we have a couple kids, like work is tight, like money's tight, like there's this thing going on over there. And so it's like not obvious the things that you could like take away that are like making you not turned on at all.
Yeah. I think, inevitably there are some people that I would say, would life look different if we just took sex off the table entirely? And I will admit there are a number of people that I will say that to. So people with young kids, let's say they have kids 18 months apart, 2 or 3 years apart. No one is sleeping. Everyone is resentful. Everyone is exhausted. I will often say, I'll give them sort of a get out of jail free card and say, how about if we take sex totally off the table until your youngest starts elementary school? And it's usually one person says, oh, thank God. And the other person says, really? And rolls their eyes at me. But for some people, you almost want to give them that out. So why are they placing so much of a focus on the importance of sexual activity when it's nothing but burdensome for them? Having said that, before we get to that point, there's going to be a lot of kind of exploring and conversations and trying things out. The long list of things that we can take off the brakes and the long list of things that we can put on the gas before we get to that point and say, let's just take it off the table.
It's quite the take. I've never heard that before.
Taking it off
yes.
the menu. Yeah.
Some people, like I don't know, if you're not the one that has low desire, like you could be listening to it and be like, oh my God, that's like my worst nightmare.
Yeah. But partners also know when sex is unrewarding for the other person. And, unless you're a narcissist, it doesn't feel good for you to know that every single time you're engaging in sexual activity, it's done out of a feeling of obligation for the other person. So sometimes it's a welcome pause for both people, including the higher desire person. I can think of a few people I'm seeing right now where we've put a temporary hiatus on sex until we work on pleasure before we bring it back in.
For the higher desire partner, do they start doubting whether they want to be in the relationship at all, if that's the case?
They can. And, it becomes important to talk about other outlets for their sexual desire. So what is reasonable? Is it, and some of the listeners are not going to like this, but is it finding out other outlets like exercise or distraction or other things like that? But in the higher desire person who's really motivated to make the relationship work, they are willing to do those other things to temporarily quell their higher desire, if it means in the long term the potential of a better sex life.
Because I mean, it's hard to do percentages, but I imagine there's quite a bit of people listening who would think, I can't have a happy relationship unless I'm like having sex.
Right.
So are you saying that that's possible to have a happy relationship if you're not having sex? So
again, I think if we think about it as a hiatus, like a temporary hiatus, to really understand how do we make this situation rewarding for both of you. I've seen it over and over again in my practice. Then, there is buy-in from the higher desire person. Now, there's also time limits around that. So I usually say, how about we put a pause on this for the next 3 months?
Oh, so you're not talking like multiple years?
No, I'm not talking multiple
okay.
years. Yeah. And interestingly, in those couples where there's discrepant desire, for some of them, they're only having sex once a year, maybe twice a year, birthday and anniversary, right? So when I say we're going to put a pause on this for 3 months, It's not like we're departing significantly from their current sexual frequency. Instead, what we're doing is we're removing the expectation of sex, which then frees up an opportunity to explore again and be creative.
Yeah, such an interesting. I'd imagine there are moments where like sex is pretty much off the table. Like if you just had a kid and like you're not having sex in the first 6 weeks. I guess it's probably not the first 3 months anyway of like that whole experience as it is. And so,
yeah. And I see individuals with vulvovaginal pain where for some of them, intercourse, putting anything into the vagina is impossible. And so that's a whole other conversation. That's just not a 3-month hiatus. That could be permanently, we're not going to be putting anything into the vagina. Mm-hmm. But it also invites the couple to think about other ways to have pleasure as well.
Do you ever, so when you're treating people, what I think is so interesting about you is like, you are a sex therapist, but you're also a psychologist and you publish so many papers. So when you are seeing people, are you just seeing the individual or are you also seeing the couple at the same time?
Yeah, so my preference is always to see a couple because, again, these kinds of nuances that you and I are talking about right now are entirely filtered through the person who's in my office's perspective, right? So right down to what the other partner's actually doing, what they're thinking, what their expectations are, their patterns of spontaneous desire is all filtered through.
And they might not like you. Like if it was just the person in the office and they're like, oh, well, Dr. Brotto told me to maybe you should pause for 3 months. And they're like what?
I get that a lot. But there's also a lot of reasons why it can be so difficult to have the partner in the room. So the most obvious explanation is if the belief is it's your low desire that is at the root of our difficulty, then you go and have your low desire fixed. And once it's fixed, come back to the relationship and we'll be able to have satisfying sex again. And so that's why we always start with psychoeducation, that, we're obviously going to address some of the obvious reasons for this person's low desire, but there's going to be a lot about the facets of the relationship that we're not able to adequately address if I'm just seeing one person.
Now, when it comes into the actual sexual encounter between a couple and making that as enjoyable as possible, obviously we talked at length about like the beginning of a relationship. It's very novel. So do you recommend like introducing novelty for couples, or is
100%.
Or do you feel like that's a Band-Aid?
No, it's not a Band-Aid. When we do this kind of really comprehensive intake assessment where, and what I love to do is ask them to paint a picture for me. So tell me about a recent sexual encounter that went really well. Tell me about a sexual encounter that you think didn't go so well. And it's amazing how much information you can glean when someone paints a picture in that way and tells a story. And so novelty or lack of novelty is one of the things that I will often hear. It's done in a predictable way with a predictable series of steps. There's certain touches that happen. It's always after the 11 o'clock news. And then interestingly, couples are surprised when all of their problems go away when they're on vacation. And they think that there's something about the hotel room that is creating more desire for them. Oh, yeah, it absolutely is. The vacation sex desire phenomenon. And then I'll say there's nothing about the hotel room that is eliciting your desire. It's because there's novelty. You're in a different place. Maybe you're having sex in the living room of the hotel and not just the bedroom, or you're having sex in the morning as opposed to late at night. You're spending more time, you're being more adventurous, you're not concerned about someone next door hearing you, so you're more likely to let those natural sounds out. People are really, really constricted with their kind of natural moaning sounds. There's actually been really interesting research that shows the number of people that kind of hold that back. And yet it's a natural aspect of sexual arousal that can further induce arousal, both for the person but also for the partner hearing it. So all of the kind of magic of the hotel room boils down to novelty in the end.
I found that to be so fascinating. I mean, because like it's hard to tell like what's a myth and what's not. But I mean, the idea of going away on vacation and then people having much better, like, do you see that to be like an immediate fix for people, even if they have low desire, like the getting away and going on vacation, or it doesn't always happen like that for people?
No, it usually doesn't happen. They'll kind of write it off as a one-off, right?
Yeah.
So yes, it happened. It was great on vacation, and now we're back to our life, and we're back into our quote normal pattern of low desire. And I will often dwell on helping them to articulate out loud why it was so pleasurable on vacation. And again, getting away from this idea that there's something magical about the room itself. And yet it was much more about their intentions that they brought into it. And guess what? Those same intentions that you brought to that hotel room in Hawaii, you can bring into your bedroom in your mundane life.
But so for the low desire partner, can most of them like get in a pleasurable, aroused mood on vacation? Like,
many of them do. Okay. I would say of the couples that I see, where it's that picture of low desire, discrepant desire, many of them will say that those problems go away on vacation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think about, like, I mentioned the honeymoon phase of a relationship before, but there's so much about life that's just hard.
Yeah.
There's just so many things that we go through and I'm like, well, how would that not affect your sexual desire? And, it seems like it's overridden by the beginning of a relationship for a lot of people. But then you go on vacation, and it sort of is like an escape from modern life, at least for like a week.
Yeah.
And so you're able to like get in another mood, but that's like not your daily life. That's
Correct.
Not like
it's very
your
artificial.
life. Yeah, it's very artificial.
Yeah.
So
yeah. But again, what can we learn from that? And rather than saying, "Oh well, it's just a vacation thing," can we use it as an opportunity to really understand what did I do differently, and I and partner do differently to make it more satisfying sex on vacation that actually falls within our control, as opposed to something that is totally outside our control and, wrapped up in the nature of the room and the location, et cetera.
Now, going back to the original example about the grocery list, so what does someone actually do with that, like in real time, if they're like having sex and they find themselves just going somewhere else?
Yeah. So with Sarah, first and foremost, normalizing that. I mean, we have distractible minds. We know that. And in fact, our minds are becoming even more distractible. Thank you, technology. And I think that there's also this almost prioritizing, or there's like a badge of honor if we feel like we can multitask, right? And so we get a lot of practice multitasking during the day. And then we're surprised when we continue to do that in the context of sexual activity. Like it should just all of a sudden stop, and we should be fully present during sex. Yet we've spent, hours every day, week upon week, month after month, really kind of making that skilled, so refined. And so for me, the answer has been mindfulness for a number of years, a few decades, in fact, where mindfulness, which it has roots in Buddhist Eastern meditation practice, but is really a secular practice. Anyone can do it, whether you're agnostic or religious or Buddhist or not. And it's a combination of paying attention. So for Sarah, it's about noticing when the mind has drifted off to the grocery list and bringing it back and rooted in the sensations, the current sensations that are happening during sex. But that's only half of it. The other half of it is how she does that. And she has to do it in a compassionate way. So rather than, the grocery list, I'll never pay attention to sex again, what's wrong with me? You say, of course my mind drifted off. I'm a multitasker. Let me guide it back. So it's that combination of paying attention with compassion and kindness that creates mindfulness, a mindful practice.
So how would a couple, how does that factor into all the things that we discussed earlier with spontaneous, responsive? Like, how could a couple practice that together?
Yeah, so two different things wrapped up in your question is, the first is, how does it factor in? And it factors in absolutely every aspect of planning sex, to being aware of the kinds of elicitors that will facilitate arousal, to keeping your mind in the moment, which would allow arousal to convert to responsive desire. The role of mindfulness in every single turn of that sexual response cycle is really quite important and really, really substantiated by the science. So that's kind of the where it fits in mindfulness. Now the how do couples practice it? After teaching mindfulness and studying it for close to 25 years, what I've observed is that it's actually really important for people to practice on their own first, right? So we want people to have confidence and competency to know when their mind takes off and know how to bring it back in a compassionate way in these kinds of low stakes scenarios on your own, so that you have some skill and competence to be able to apply it in a much more higher stakes emotional scenario that is sexual activity. But absolutely, there's exercises that couples can do together. Masters and Johnson defined one, which is sensate focus. They never described it as a mindful practice, but it absolutely was a mindful practice, right? So when one person is touching the other and the person who's receiving the touch is giving the instruction to just pay attention to sensations without expectation, that's mindfulness, right? Tuning in without judgment, that is mindfulness. And I remember when I wrote a paper kind of making that link back in 2007, and the number of people that reached out to me and said, "Oh my gosh, Laura, you're so brilliant. You labeled it mindfulness." And I said, "No, Masters and Johnson have been doing this all along." And in fact, when Virginia Johnson was a young girl and her mother was touching her face as a way to teach her to self-soothe, she was teaching young Virginia mindfulness at the time. She just didn't have the word for it, but all the instructions were imbued in this kind of, compassionate presence, which is mindfulness. So the idea with a couple is that they would start out on their own, and then they would gradually take those skills into non-sexual but partnered-based activities, and then eventually into sex itself.
So give me an example of that, of how that could progress, what each person will be doing, and that will lead to sex.
Yeah. So in the groups that I run, let's assume it's a woman with low desire. So what I'll start by having her do is have a bath or a shower and pay attention to sensations. So that's this notion of building interoceptive awareness, which it turns out most of us are really bad at. And there's a gendered facet to this as well. Women are poorer than men are at being aware of internal sensations within their body. So a bath or a shower is great because it's something she's doing anyways. And all we're adding in is the instruction to pay attention to internal sensations. So things like, how do your feet feel if you're standing in the shower? Do you actually feel, the cold tiles on the floor? Do you feel the water against you? Can you sense internally what's happening? So that she starts to build that awareness of internal sensations. And then we can gradually build from there. She might use a handheld mirror to observe her own genitals. So again, could be very emotionally upsetting for some, or maybe a curiosity for others. And so building an awareness of, okay, what do I see? What are the colors, the sizes, the textures? We'll then build touch within that. So non-goal-oriented touch on her own. Again, as we continue to strengthen that muscle of mindfulness. And then we'll talk about mindful masturbation, right? So masturbation without the goal of orgasm, but rather the goal of awareness of sensations. And if it culminates in orgasm, fine, you can pay attention to that as well. But it really is about, can you notice arousal so that you can differentiate neutral from aroused, or low level of arousal from medium level of arousal to higher level of arousal. So that's all within one person. And then from there, we can start to build on very similar exercises, but now you welcome a partner into that scenario. So starting with non-sexual awareness to progressively moving on to more sexual kinds of exchanges.
Now, you said that mindfulness can be applied to so many different things. how well have you seen it work across many of the things that we've talked about today? Is it like a universal thing that it helps in a lot of different scenarios, or even mindfulness could not be effective for some parts of the population?
I think if this were 15 years ago, I probably would have given a much more guarded response, which is, we don't have enough science, and we've seen it effective for these really kind of niche populations of people with sexual problems. But given where we're at right now in 2026, with the volume of different studies that have looked at the role of mindfulness in women, in men, smaller populations of gender diverse people, for arousal, for desire, for orgasm, for delayed ejaculation, for lack of pleasure. I don't want to say it's a panacea, but I will go on record in saying it's probably one of the most critical facets of satisfying sex for all people.
So it's interesting because, I wonder, when we're talking about the turn-offs, I wonder if, being mindful takes your mind away, I guess, from the turn-offs in a sense, and then allows you to be more present to the sexual environment.
Yeah. So let's say that the turn-off is I open my eyes and I see a pile of laundry at the side of the room.
Yeah.
Right? Then compassionate mindfulness could probably be very helpful for that, right? You notice it, you notice that your mind is drawn to it, and you kind of put a pin in it, and you redirect your mind back to the here and now. And so that could be a really, really helpful way, and I certainly have seen that work for a lot of people. But if the inhibitors, let's say, let's come back to bad breath, because that's something that no one wants to talk about, but is such a potent inhibitor for a lot of people. Ignoring bad breath or telling yourself it's not that bad, just ignore it. I mean, it's kind of like the big pink elephant in the room. The more you say it's not there, the bigger it becomes. And it has a lot to do with where we process odors in the hindbrain, et cetera, the oldest part of the brain. Really, really hard to ignore that. So it really depends. But that kind of mindful practice to certain kinds of inhibitors can work really well.
So fascinating. I mean, I new to the whole mindfulness thing, and the idea of it being so potent for a lot of the things that we're talking about provides some hope at some level. What are there ever scenarios where people are going through their journey with processing their own low desire, and how would you know if the relationship or the other person or attraction or those things are influencing the low desire? Let's just say you've been in a relationship for a really long time, and I imagine there are scenarios where you're no longer attracted to the person at some level. So even if you go on this journey of mindfulness, you're still looking at them and you're not really turned on at some level. Is that a common thing?
It is. And, the first thing I will say in response to that is we want to make sure that this is not a situation where one person is asexual.
Yeah.
Right? So somewhere between 1% and 4% of the population do identify as asexual. And it's actually been a significant part of my own research is trying to differentiate asexuality from really, really low desire. And it came from a lot of skepticism about the entity of asexuality as a discrete sexual orientation. So we need to make sure that we're asking those questions first. And there's certainly ways that we can do that. We can look at patterns over the course of a person's life before the current relationship, and maybe they have been engaging in sex, but they've actually still been they've been asexual their entire life. And asexual people do still engage in sex for the non-sexual aspects of a relationship. So we want to make sure that we're careful about that kind of a situation. And if it's not that, then we also want to consider the fact that attractions do change, right, over the course of a relationship. And as bodies age, that some people really have a much harder time with the impact of aging and changing bodies than other people. And we want to address that with some psychoeducation and maybe other methods as well. Maybe there's irrational beliefs that are kind of infiltrated in that, like we should always look youthful, or I'm making an effort to be more youthful and healthy and you're not, and this is impacting my attraction towards you. So we could certainly address that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really, really hard to change your attraction for another person, right? There may be, we can influence admiration. You can grow to admire a person in a different way, but that's quite different from, say, a sexual attraction to another person, which tends to start higher and then go down over the course of a relationship.
But like, is that the case in most long-term relationships?
No, it's not, because, I think of couples I see where one will say, I'm still really, really attracted to my partner, and yet I have low desire. So those are not one and the same, attraction and desire. They're quite separate. And also part of the nuance and the conversation that we need to try and understand is what role does diminishing attraction have on desire? And in the situation where attraction is still really, really high, we need to make sure that we're looking at the other factors contributing to low desire. So,
yeah. One of the series that I had watched recently, it was one of the best shows that I've ever seen. It was called DTF St. Louis.
Yep.
Have you seen this? You heard
halfway
about it?
through it right now.
Okay. It is, I don't want to spoil it for you, but there's a lot of things going on in that show around sex, and especially like middle age. I mean, I think all the characters are in their 50s.
Yeah.
But it just brings like so much of like what we're talking today could be like so painful for people, to have desire for someone and they don't have desire for you back, or to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not attracted to this person at all anymore right now.
Yeah.
And I'm committed to them, or I married them, and what do I do with all of this stuff? It, like, in a sense, it could feel suffocating for people, of like, you have to wake up every day and like deal with this.
Yeah.
Especially if once the sex was good.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And I think, I don't know how the series ends. Now I want to go and watch the rest of it. I have a couple of episodes left. But I also think that sense of mourning gets reinforced when we kind of lock into a singular picture of what desire looks like, right? It was high for the first 3 years, and I want to get back to what it was before, as opposed to this flexible notion that how desire is going to show up in this relationship, it's going to change quite a bit through these different seasons of our life.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about the fact that just the relationship in general, that like who you guys were at 25, 40, it's like a new relationship every decade or every 5 or 10 years. Would you say the same thing applies to sex life?
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, if we come back to those studies that look at those couples who are really thriving sexually into their old age, it's not necessarily the couples that are having the most sex. It's those couples who can adapt and are flexible and have excellent communication skills to actually talk about the adaptation over time, and this sense of reinventing what sexual desire means for them at a different stage of life.
Is obviously you want to get to a place where both people are enjoying the sexual encounter. I mean, there's just the sexual encounter itself, but is there a rhythm in a relationship that would be more healthy than not? Like, for example, like if you're having sex less than X amount of times a week or a month or something, then you're probably going to deviate into a territory that is not going to lead to a positive result.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to talk about that kind of sexual frequency number, because it's what a lot of people ask. What is normal? Or this feeling of, we only have sex a few times a year, and even though it's fantastic and pleasure-filled, it's so infrequent. Therefore, I feel like something's wrong with our sex life. And this is, a real problem in kind of using those metrics as the measure of quality sex. And again, if we look at the research that has asked this question, and Peggy Kleinplatz has an entire book that's focused on optimal sex. So these people who say that they have these incredible sexual encounters that are, out of this world, and sexual frequency does not factor into how they describe these incredible sexual
Really?
encounters at all. The frequency does not factor in at all. It's being present, in sync, aligned, prioritized, having good communication, and the number of times a week, month, or year they have sex doesn't factor in.
Yeah, because I feel like anytime, this question's asked, like, how often should we be having sex? I feel like the answer is like more is better and frequency. And so to hear you say that just unravels like a lot of, I guess, preconceived notions that people have about the subject.
Yeah, and some people really insist on having a number. And so I'll draw from the literature and I'll say recent studies show that happy couples have sex about once a week. But if you look at how that number has changed over time, 20 years ago, it was 10 more times per year. And 10 years before that, it was another 10 more times per year on top of that. So overall, we're having less sex today in 2026 than we were in the 1980s and 1990s.
But you see that as a neutral thing? Or there's something that is not beneficial or healthy for people that is leading to that decline?
Yeah, so the studies that have looked at that, these really, really large population-based surveys, they see it in a negative way, right? So the question is basically, why are we having sex less today than we were decades ago? And most of the explanations are not good explanations. It's not, well, we're having less sex because we're spending more time communicating or we're spending more time doing other enjoyable things. It tends to be higher levels of stress, higher levels of depression, more video games, financial issues, other outlets, couples not living together, delaying being in a long-term relationship. And we know that people in partnerships have more sex than single people. Maybe that debunks some of the stereotypes or myths that listeners might have. And so on the whole, it's not seen as a good thing, the fact that we're having less sex today than we were 20 years ago.
Well, I mean, we've talked about a lot today. I think that, I only have a couple more questions. You've studied this for a long time. And so like after all the years of like studying and treating low desire, like what have you actually seen happen? What's possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to the person who comes into the office and we can reassure them that they're not broken through educating them about desire being responsive, that desire is accessible, that there are intentional things that they and in their relationship can do to feel desire, maybe again or for the first time. I think that is so powerful and can be really life-changing for people that have kind of bought into this idea that I'm totally broken. And I think that's such a reassuring message, as we live longer, right? Our lifespan is now getting longer and longer every time that this gets measured. And people should expect to continue to have some degree of sexual identity until the day they die. Now, again, that might not mean sexual activity, but a sense of who they are as a sexual person. Is that through masturbation? Is it through fantasy? Is it through just a feeling they have within them that they have a capacity to get sexually aroused if they want to, that pleasure is important and accessible to them? Those should be things that continue to follow us into the latter years of our life.
Have you seen couples who have been like completely disconnected become genuinely erotic again?
100%. 100%, as have all of my sex therapy colleagues as well.
It's amazing.
And it's within reach.
So, I mean, I think for the person listening who's kind of navigating a season where desire feels distant, what would you want them to understand about the ebb and flow of desire over a lifetime?
Yeah, so I think, certainly thinking about desire more as a dimmer switch rather than an on-off light switch is really helpful. Even just that image of It's not just here or gone. It does ebb and flow, and it's context dependent and dependent on your sense of who you are and your openness. And I think curiosity, we don't spend enough time being curious and playful, and we tend to think of that as being maybe a childish trait. Whereas, again, coming back to the work of Peggy Kleinplatz, those couples who reported blissful sex, they were creative, they were curious, they were experimental. And we should be giving ourselves permission to go to that place to rediscover what sexual desire feels like for me, and set aside some of those myths that tell us you shouldn't do that, or a serious person isn't playful and curious. All sorts of myths that really need dismantling when we think about having desire and pleasure in the long term.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. I feel like I learned so much from you. So
thank you. It was a great conversation.
Yeah.